This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 624 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, sports fans, there's no better time than today to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 into your FanDuel DFS account, and you will be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. It is a limited time offer, so be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. It's a mailbag show. Let's get to these questions. Now, I'm not surprised by this at all, but there were a lot of questions this week that had to do with the How Players Rebound study that I published on Tuesday. I would probably listen to that episode if you haven't already before listening to today's mailbag. But the first question about it is from Twitter. It's from @BobbyJoe354-63311. It says, JJ, on today's podcast, you mentioned Josh Jacobs as a dynasty sell due to a drop of 10 or more spots in his ADP. We've seen Jacobs have multiple RB1 seasons. What do you think accounts for the drop in ADP, and what would you be looking to move him for on a rebuilding team? So keep in mind that I used January ADP for the year-over-year study. In January of 2021, Jacobs had an ADP of 19 overall according to Dynasty League Football's data. In February, it was 23, so it fell 4 spots, likely due to some variance. In March, it was 22. In April, though, of 2021, it was 41. And that's more or less where it stayed until the season started. But then in January of 2022, it was 59. So what happened? Well, that initial drop in ADP from March to April likely had to do with the Raiders signing Kenyon Drake. If you remember, people weren't very bullish on Jacobs' pass-catching upside with the Raiders getting Drake. So his ADP fell. And then it fell another 19 spots from August until January. But I will say, I do think with Jacobs in particular, there's a little bit of ADP variance going on. It just so happens that Jacobs' ADP shifted dramatically after the Kenyon Drake signing, soon after his January data point. And while it does show him with a big drop in ADP from August of last year to January this year, the February and March ADP data showed that he started to normalize a little bit and rise a little bit in ADP once again. In other words, the January data point does look like it was more of a blip. Now, I don't think this means the study is irrelevant. I do studies to find trends, to make us analyze deeper on an individual level. That's no different here with Josh Jacobs. And I think the point still stands with Jacobs, generally speaking. If you're rebuilding, you may not want to take him on. And it's very, very unlikely that we're ever going to see him as a top 20 dynasty asset ever again. But could we see a Joe Mixon trajectory? Definitely possible. Absolutely possible. I actually thought that Jacobs was more of a buy than a sell before doing this study. And I very rarely am buying into running backs in Dynasty, as a lot of you guys know. But that's how I want people to think about these studies that I do. Just because there are strategic parameters set doesn't mean you blindly follow them. It's just a starting point. That's why I said on the show to use that list of players who drop in ADP as a starting point for players to sell. It doesn't mean you automatically should be selling those players. But again, this is a study about market value. It's not a study about production. A running back's value naturally depreciates as he reaches 25, 26, 27 years old. Now, Jacobs is a different case because he's still just 24, which is why he's an easy comparison to Joe Mixon. But as a running back increases in age, if he's not giving you elite production, he's likely going to see a dip in market value, even if it's a small one. He may still be fine production-wise, but that's the difference between a rebuilding team and a win-now team. If you're a win-now team, you can take on a player like Leonard Fournette, even if he's someone who's not going to gain a ton of market value. Fournette's projected to be a high-end RB2, low-end RB1 this year. It's just that he's 27 years old. So it's highly unlikely we see him take some massive jump in ADP. If you're a rebuilding team and you know that that asset's not going to appreciate, it's not worth it. It's not worth taking that player on unless you're in a league that trades a lot and is super active. Because if that's the case, then you can just flip a guy like Fournette later on in the season. But there's obvious risks to doing something like that too. So let me sum this up as clearly as I possibly can. Yes, the data on that episode was probably shocking to hear. Yes, you probably heard it and you panicked about some of the players on your team. Because yes, generally speaking, if a player from January to January sees a significant drop in ADP, it's not good news at all. It's usually the start of a trend downwards. But please do not treat this as the end all. It's just a very convenient starting point. To me, there's a big difference between someone like Josh Jacobs and someone like Laviska Shenault. Or heck, even someone like Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott saw a January to January ADP drop of 27. It makes far more sense to be selling someone like Elliott, especially as we get closer to redraft season, than it does someone like Josh Jacobs. A ton more sense. And by the way, that list of players was sent out to late round fantasy football newsletter subscribers on Thursday. You can go subscribe to that newsletter on lateround.com. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Chuck. It says, JJ, in light of your last episode regarding ADP slides, should we be selling Christian McCaffrey? Again, I just want to be clear that you shouldn't solely use the data I provided on Tuesday to make your decision. It's just an input. And I think it's a helpful input, but it is just an input. I can tell you, though, that Christian McCaffrey has yet to see a drop in ADP of 10 or more throughout his career, according to DLF January ADP data. I think you can probably find other months where the drop is significant enough to where he'd trigger the 10-plus spot drop. But January to January, it has not happened yet. He dropped 9 spots year over year. Is he someone to sell? Again, that's a different question. Based on the study, you don't absolutely have to. Based on your team and where it's at, I don't think it's crazy to trade him away. I'd say it's likely that he's never going to see top 5, top 7 overall ADP ever again. That's just how the market moves with running backs. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Tom. It says, what's up, JJ? What's up, Tom? Curious how you feel about the Packers wide receivers. Did Amari Rodgers increase enough in his year 2 model to warrant the Packers taking such a slow approach to the wide receiver market, or do they have to buck their own trend and grab some wide receivers early in the draft this year? Thanks as always, JJ. I'm not that much of a believer in Amari Rodgers. He was a 75th percentile prospect in my models. He was well below that 80th percentile mark that I want wide receivers to hit entering the league. And he had pretty neutral draft capital delta, which is just my prospect score versus draft capital. You can learn all about that in the late round prospect guide available for $14.99 on lateround.com. But Rodgers didn't do anything as a rookie, so his year 2 model score is now in the 63rd percentile. Since 2011, we've had 36 wide receivers in that 60th to 70th percentile in the year 2 model, and only one of them gave you a season with 10 or more PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. And 0 of them gave you a season above 12 points per game. Amari Rodgers would have to be an insane outlier to be anything significant in fantasy football. That's just based on history. It seems clear to me that we're finally going to see Green Bay use some draft capital on wide receivers. This next question is another one from Patreon. It's from Garrett. It says, fascinating study on the podcast of ADP rebounds. Thanks. Wondering your thoughts on reversing the advice given, meaning rebuilding teams are encouraged to trade these declining market value assets, but should competing teams use this as a buying opportunity? In other words, if you're going for a championship year after year, do you just trash future market value analysis and grab production to put points on the board? Or as Les Snead says, F them picks. A concrete example, I have a team coming off a championship. It's loaded, but could use help at flex. I gave the 112 for an admittedly aging DeAndre Hopkins, but a better bet to be a productive starter this year than whatever I would get at 112. Yeah, I think it's totally fine to do this. I would question giving up your entire future for declining players because you'll eventually hit a wall where you have no appreciating assets and no picks to help you rebuild. But if you have one-off deals where you're in win now mode and you know that you're going to get better production from a certain player versus a pick, go for it. It's very similar to what I talked about with Leonard Fournette earlier. Is Fournette technically a depreciating asset? Sort of, yeah. It's unlikely you're going to see huge gains in the market from Leonard Fournette. But is he someone who can help you win this year? Absolutely. So trading for him is fine. I just wouldn't trade for all of those guys. You still need some semblance of balance so you don't really screw yourself in a year or two. And remember, there's a lot of variance to fantasy football. If you're putting all of your eggs in the win now bucket, you're being a little bit arrogant because things can change. Players can drop off and just not perform well. They can get hurt. It can really screw you if you do that. So yes, you can do that, but I would not go all in on only getting productive assets for this current season. This next question is another one from Patreon and says, how do you feel about De'Ami Brown this year? He seems to fit as the deep ball wide receiver for Carson Wentz. So I wrote up De'Ami Brown in the late round prospect guide because I have an entire section about my year 2 model, and I have profiles for year 2 players. Brown was someone that my model liked, but the model likely missed on him. He was an 83rd percentile prospect, so it's not like the model was in love with him, but he did get over that 80th percentile mark. Now he's in the 72nd percentile in year 2 model score. So he most definitely has a better outlook than someone like Amari Rodgers. But players in that 70th to 75th percentile range rarely are giving you any sort of worthwhile season. Just 5% of them since 2011 have provided a season in years 2 or 3 with 12 plus PPR points per game. The 75th to 80th percentile tier is significantly better, but he didn't get there. Chances are, and you should be playing the odds here, he's not going to be anything in fantasy football. And it's unfortunate because my model definitely thought that there could have been something there. This next question says, do you think the average fantasy player would be better off if they didn't know or care who was coaching a given team? In the world of narratives, the whole Coach X loves to feature his insert position of a Hall of Fame caliber player he coached seems to lead people astray, e.g. Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Okay, so I do have some thoughts on this. And I want to start with a few random thoughts on Clyde Edwards-Helaire in particular. Yes, CEH ended up being a bust, more than likely. He at least didn't live up to that end of first round draft capital. And I'm not saying the person who asked this question is saying this, so please don't think that this is directed at you at all. I just think people have lost sight of the fact that it's not like CEH was some bad prospect. Did he get propelled in rankings due to landing spot? Of course. Should he have been ranked ahead of Jonathan Taylor after his draft? Of course not. I'm not making that excuse. That would be stupid. Process-wise, it wasn't the right move to shift him ahead of Jonathan Taylor. But the way people talk about CEH, it's as if he was like Trey Sermon as a prospect. CEH was not even a bad prospect. It's just the results seem to be skewing people's minds about him. I just had to get that off my chest. But to your question, I don't think the average fantasy player would be better off not knowing history and how a coach deployed his players historically. I think the average fantasy player would benefit from understanding what that means. So don't remove it from people's brains. Just teach them that personnel typically drives these coaching narratives. It's similar to how I view something like Mike Tomlin and his use of bell cow running backs. Have his teams used bell cows pretty frequently? Yes. But he's also had Le'Veon Bell during his prime, D'Angelo Williams when Bell was out, James Conner, and Najee Harris. James Conner was also used as a bell cow down the stretch last year. And D'Angelo Williams had a very, very good NFL career. Clearly, those players are good. I don't think that we can just assume that literally anyone in Pittsburgh would see 250 touches a season. The player still has to be a good running back. It's more so that if the player is good, we know the ceiling is there. We know that Tomlin has given that player a lot of touches in the past. Having that knowledge is not a bad thing. Najee Harris was on a lot of my redraft teams last year because I thought he was a good prospect. And I felt pretty confident the Steelers would deploy him as a bell cow, as they did. Tomlin's history reinforced that whole idea and narrative. But it was only because I saw Harris as a good player. If he wasn't a good player, that might not have happened. So I don't think it's so binary. Are there instances where fantasy managers really stretch these narratives? Oh yeah, most definitely. Some of the stuff that I see about this is insane. But those people, instead of ignoring what data is saying, they should just give that data more context. They should just be more realistic. If we have a backbone of a coach doing something, that's not a bad thing. I don't think ignoring that is necessary. I just think overrating that is very easy to do. There's a fine line. So let's just be self-aware that it's easy to do. The bottom line here is to always remember that personnel leads to these coaching decisions most. Personnel is what's driving a lot of this historical data. This next question is from @blame_Hoffman. It says, hey JJ, love it all. Thanks. Did the Jets' attempt at Tyreek Hill make you nervous at all about Elijah Moore? Seems like a big wide receiver acquisition is on their mind, if not through trade, then the draft. Or did you already have that baked in? Thanks for everything, Jeff. Look, it's no secret that I really like Elijah Moore. It's also no secret that the Jets have a glaring need at wide receiver. So no, the Tyreek Hill interest doesn't surprise me. I'm fully expecting them to draft a wide receiver, probably high. If you want to wait to get Elijah Moore until after the NFL draft, that's probably not a bad idea at all. But in Dynasty, you're buying into players and their overall value. Elijah Moore, according to my analysis and my models, is a very, very good wide receiver. He has a very good chance to hit. I mean, he already sort of has hit. Adding another player to that offense wouldn't make him bad. A guy like Tyreek Hill could change his short-term production a little bit, sure. But Moore's overall value is tied to him as a player above all else. And that's how I view Dynasty in general. The last question this week is from @SYAnalytics. It says, in a nutshell, what's next for your prospect model? I would imagine that the situation of players getting drafted into may be interesting, looking at various proxies, like how a team ranked in pass to run, or where teammates are getting drafted, etc. I do think landing spot matters to some degree, as I've talked about before, but situations can change pretty drastically and pretty fast. So it's a really, really tough thing to nail down. Honestly, though, there's still a ton of data to uncover with this stuff. There are different ways to present things like breakout age that I want to dig into next year. I try to look into those things and retest the model each and every year. And that's going to be no different in 2022 to 2023. And as I said in the prospect guide, which again, lateround.com, go buy that thing. At the very least, even if you hate the analysis, there's some dad jokes in it. But as I said in that guide, eventually, hopefully, I'll have tight end and quarterback models too. So there's that to look forward to as well. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet to subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. I really, really appreciate it. I know there are tons and tons of questions about this free agency period. I'm going to hopefully answer those questions early next week with a free agency podcast. I'll talk to you then.